I hope at least, because I expect some discussion this afternoon, so I would like to have your cooperation. Because this afternoon will be spent mainly on the discussion, but we have still 3 small talks, which in particularly affect the operational aspects of doing clinical trials in children. And I think one of the key players here is, I think, the industry, and therefore I'm happy to introduce James Strait from MSD, who will talk about, on behalf of the industry, about recruitment and feasibility challenges. So James, may I give you the floor?
Yes. Yes, so thank you very much. First of all, thank you to the EMA, the FDA, and Health Canada for the invitation and the opportunity to speak here. I'm actually going to be speaking on behalf of FPA UCOPE. We have 10 industry partners. We've been actually conducting a series of teleconferences and meetings over the past few months, discussing all of these issues, and had a quite nice working relationship in developing our responses. I guess on reflection and listening to what I've heard today, I think that the majority of what I have in this presentation has probably been said already. So it may be a matter of emphasis more than anything, because I think we are aware, many of us, what the issues are. And the real challenge here is, what are the next steps and what are the practical things we take to reach there? Nevertheless, I'll steal Ms. Fisher's joke from earlier that I love to talk, so I will take up my full time allotment. So here is sort of a positive feedback loop depiction of the challenges we're facing in pediatric pulmonary hypertension investigation. I think no one would be surprised. Obviously, pediatric trials are difficult to run for a variety of reasons, and we see that here. You know, to the left here in the box, you see we've got all the challenges. We've got rare disease. We've got recruitment challenges. We've got many, many simultaneous developments of treatments going on. This, of course, leads to difficulty in the design of the trials. The trials become very difficult to complete, and we then end up with a lack of conclusive data, and the cycle continues onward. This is a somewhat small depiction of what everyone has already been saying today, but there are significant barriers to successful trial completion in pediatric pulmonary hypertension. I think many of us are obviously, or I should say all of us, are committed to developing better medications or approved medications for children with pulmonary hypertension, but these challenges we're facing have made that impossible to date. So first of all, we have an orphan disease. We have a heterogeneous etiology. To create a useful trial, a feasible trial, we obviously have to apply exclusion criteria to make it homogeneous enough for us to get an endpoint that's analyzable and acceptable to regulators. This results in the population being even more restricted. I'll show you some numbers later on the recruitment rates that all of the companies have been able to achieve, and I think this is very evident how challenging it is. There's a number of competing trials. We're all competing for the same patients to encourage them to join these trials. New treatments are assessed on top of background standard of care. We've already discussed that. I think every parent, every physician, when you see that a therapy is working in adults, many times you want to have the best therapy for your child, obviously. So we face the fact that almost all of these drugs are being used in children as soon as they're approved in adults. That gets to the lack of equipoise that we're talking about. Specialist centers are needed to perform complex endpoint assessments. We've heard from the patients, from the families, that it can become challenging to travel to these specialist centers. It's much more convenient for quality of life to be able to go nearby. We understand that. At the same time, we're challenged by the fact that it's only the specialist centers that are able to complete the sorts of measurements and diagnostics that are required in a way with small enough noise that we can get analyzable endpoints to then take for approval for drugs. And then finally, feasibility assessments overestimate enrollment projections. So no matter how many times we do this, no matter how many times we ask, how many patients can a site recruit, we fill out questionnaires, we decrease the numbers that people say that they can recruit because we know it can be a challenging area, we still end up many times overestimating what we can actually get in a given trial. This really reflects it. I apologize, this might be a bit small here, but in the first column there, you've got the active drugs that we're all studying. I want to draw your attention to the approximate recruitment rate in the next to last column. What you see there is we end up with on order of 0.01 to 0.03 patients per site per month. These are very small numbers, and I can tell you that these numbers don't come without a lot of people going to visit sites, going to speak with investigators, talking to patient groups, trying to do everything they can to get patients enrolled in trials. And yet still, these are the numbers that we're able to achieve. It's very difficult to achieve a success in a trial with these numbers. I'll also comment that if you look at the number of patients in the protocol, so the third column, you can see that we're talking about trials on the order of 20 to 60. We have some larger trials by some of our partners, but in general, even these 20 to 60 size patient trials are difficult to complete with these enrollment rates. And so I think when we start talking about endpoints, and I'll do that in a minute, I think we need to realize that when we talk about some endpoints that are going to require patient sizes of larger than 100 patients, it's extremely challenging. So this really reflects the fact that I'm not the first one to say this. I think that others, including Norman Stockbridge, have written papers about the difficulty of finding the right and the best endpoints for these trials. This slide is not meant for you to really examine the details, but just to say that there's a lot of endpoints out there, and we've already had discussion about some of them. And I'll highlight three that we in industry think might have the most potential. But I think we're all interested in getting to the bottom of this endpoint discussion. And whatever that endpoint becomes, I think everyone can work with, but I think we have to really come to a decision and come to some alignment that would be very helpful. So here's the challenge. So how can drug development processes, so the overall trial design, endpoint selection, statistical methodology, regulatory discussions, be reimagined to improve the rate of success in developing effective therapies for pediatric PAH? So here's some potential solutions. First of all, endpoint validation and harmonization. I'll discuss that in a minute. Next, alternative trial design and analysis options. Data pooling, validation of a PD parameter to enable extrapolation. I think that from what I've heard today, we spent a lot of time talking about the challenges. We've also talked about these particular elements, but if I would highlight a couple of things that are very, that have come up in the discussions that we've had with our industry partners time and time again, it is the interest in extrapolation from adult patients, and it is the harmonization of regulatory procedures and harmonization of the endpoints that we're going to look at. So I'll talk briefly about endpoint validation and harmonization. So this is a slide, others have showed this, but basically what it shows is in the middle column you have the determinants of risk, so things like clinical evidence of RV failure, progression of symptoms, et cetera. And then obviously if we have clinical evidence of RV failure, that would predict higher risk, lower risk if we don't have that. I think these can form the basis of the endpoints that we choose to perform our studies. So here are three endpoints that we're highlighting as having potential for clinical trials for pediatric pulmonary hypertension. We've heard a lot of ideas today, and I think that we would be very willing to explore alternative endpoints, but these at least seem the most practical from our current experience and in what we're seeing in the trial in terms of what our sites can perform. So first of all, echocardiography. First of all, the strength being it's a non-invasive procedure. I think we've heard very strongly from our patient groups and patient representatives that this has great strengths being non-invasive. It is already widely used for monitoring in patient population. Limitations, obviously, high operator variability. The sample size is likely to be larger, and I wouldn't say, well, there's no consensus or there's limited consensus on exactly which echo endpoints we're going to use as primary outcomes. We end up with sort of a panel of echo outcomes that people are interested in looking at. Cardiac MRI is similar in many ways in that we get a non-invasive test. It is quite palatable to many. And its further benefits that we have very good correlation between right heart cath and MRI-derived mean PA pressures. Requires a smaller sample size and less variability than echo. Obviously, the problem is, has been mentioned, in especially younger patients, it requires sedation. So long scan times, limitations on compatibility. You can have different MRI machines giving different results. You have to standardize things. And then finally, you need an experienced center. So that's a challenge. NT-proBNP, it's a very simple procedure. It's maybe a predictor of PAH prognosis, but there's obvious problems with specificity. And it's limited by its insight into the etiology. Alternative trial design and analysis. So we've mentioned that there are challenges. We've mentioned that perhaps by finding the right endpoint, we can get to a useful trial outcome. However, I think that some of the most interesting work has been around reimagining how we do these trials, how we analyze the outcomes, how the endpoints. I think our modeling and simulation group came up with some very interesting presentations on ways to reimagine this, and I think that's quite encouraging. So first of all, data pooling and extrapolation. I think this has come up time and time again in our discussions within industry. Obviously, there are challenges. In common diseases, you can look at summary and subject-patient level data. But the problem is in rare diseases, especially pulmonary hypertension, pediatrics, we have a lot of different patient-level databases. We have a lot of heterogeneity in the patients themselves. So this can be a challenge. We have had some discussions around there may be potential for industry perhaps sharing data so that perhaps we can try and look at ways to validate some things. But I think that's something to follow up on after this meeting. Extrapolation from adult data about new drugs with similar mechanism of action can be particularly helpful. And I think this is something I really want to highlight here. We've heard some support of the extrapolation concept, and we feel quite strongly that that could be very beneficial in this area. Obviously, it is challenged that there is heterogeneity and there is a lack of accepted PD parameters. So if we are going to go down this road, I think we have to do further work around which PD parameters we're going to be looking at. So the potential solution I've already mentioned. One potential is to work across industry by sharing data, placebo data, for example, to contribute to endpoint evaluation and validation. Utilizing available supportive data from other products with same mechanism of action. We've talked about 3 main mechanisms of action, perhaps if we could share across them. And then registry or open label data. Just during lunch, I think we've already had some interesting discussions around ways that we can use registry data, and I think that's quite encouraging. I want to highlight there's been a lot of work groups. I know FDA, EMA have convened many of these work groups. And there's been a lot of interesting outcomes from this. So I'm not going to spend a long time on this. I think this would deserve a week discussion on its own. But just to say that there's been some really novel ideas. For example, leveraging multiple endpoints in small clinical trials, extension of the standard co-primary endpoints with a fallback option if you don't meet the main goal. And then finally, how perhaps we need to relax the standard significance level for pivotal trials in children. Obviously, in drugs that have been approved in adults with that logic. This is a very busy slide. I know that there have been some suggestions around randomized withdrawal design considerations. We gave this quite a bit of thought, and we discussed this over several days, actually. We currently see that there are some challenges to this, or significant challenges, and so I'll spend just a little bit of time here and then finish up. But the data on the relationship between the withdrawal period and clinical outcomes measured by these various endpoints is needed before a randomized trial can be appropriately designed to detect the difference. So the challenges are the ones that we've already been talking about. There is a big hesitation, it seems, to randomization, which is understandable. It's a chronic disease, and generally treatments are going to continue uninterrupted unless there's a strong rationale to stop them. If we utilize this withdrawal design, we're still not overcoming the key challenge in pediatrics, pulmonary hypertension research. There's a lack of consensus around the endpoint that's reliable and sensitive, and also then there is the difficulty in how do we withdraw a drug? How long is that withdrawal period going to be in order to observe the clinical event? If it's too short, the evaluation is inadequate. If it's too long, then we may have potentially irreversible progression of the disease for patients. So summary of the industry perspective. to recapitulate just a bit, so the pediatric patient numbers are very small. We want to make sure that each patient contributes to a conclusive study outcome, that no data is wasted, essentially, and that no patient's time and effort is wasted. To support optimal trial conduct, global regulatory harmonization is key. I think we're extremely encouraged by the fact that this meeting is taking place and that so many people have come here today to discuss this very important topic, and we hope to see progression in this way. And then finally, the potential approaches to improve therapeutic development. I think others have said it better than I have earlier today, but just to restate, if endpoint clarification, harmonization would be incredibly valuable for us. Echo may be good, MRI, et cetera. Data pooling, looking to pool the registry data perhaps, open label data, and then finally extrapolation. I think that the concept of extrapolation of data from adult data, I think would be extremely helpful for the improvement of the success in, or I should say the beginning of success in pediatric pulmonary hypertension drug development. So with that, I'll end, but thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, James. I think I would like to have the discussion in the plenary, and I think the various aspects will emerge because we don't have so much time anymore, so I think it's better to have the presentations first and then have the general discussion. So then I will give the floor to the next speaker, who is Christine Dehn, who will speak on behalf of the patients and the parents' view in this aspect, in particular to clinical trial challenges. So Christine.
Yes. Thank you. I'm the last speaker of today, so I don't know if that's good or bad, but a lot has been said already, and I don't want to repeat myself, so I'm going to sum up more a bit. So setting the scene, I'm from a German Heart Foundation, which is a member of the European Heart Network, and we are a patient organization. That means we represent patients that have a cardiovascular heart disease or a congenital heart disease. And so this presentation is based on interviews I've conducted with PAH families. And what is important is for you to know that all these patients are from Germany, so the situation might differ in other countries. I had phone interviews with a parent of a child that is younger than 10, a parent of a child that is now just turned 18, and an adult. And they all have a congenital heart disease, and most of them have had a Fontan operation and developed a PAH later on. So the parents, as we have already heard from Gary Fischer and also from Patrick Hassel is it? Yeah. The parents are extremely well informed. And why is that? Because they have to research a lot themselves in the internet, Mr. Google, as it was already mentioned. And they are organized in self-help groups or association. So a very key aspect to us is that patients should be informed all about on the same level. So that means there should be something like a protocol or standard guidelines that the doctor can use to inform the patient and that the patient could keep and bring home and read themselves. So this is about the treatment. We have all heard that, so I will skip it. And then about the efficacy, I just want to mention here that they are more or less dealing okay with it. And one parent was told to go to a second heart center. So we are not talking about just changing GP or changing the pediatrist, but change the center, which is quite a big distance also, to see if they have another idea. Of course, this raises hopes, but on the same hand, this causes an awkward feeling. So that means, was my child not treated in the correct way before? Or could it have been better from the beginning? There's a very important issue that due to the congenital heart disease, the patients have various health problems. So the side effects, you never can be sure where they actually come from. And I just want to mention that one patient reported that he has to take 80 pills per day. And most of them because of the protein-losing enteropathy. So you can imagine taking 80 pills for a child, how long it just takes to take the pills. And the mother told me he does this in 2 steps, and it takes 1.5 hours each day. So talking about life quality. Monitoring, we've had that also, but I want to stress here that all parents said that they can immediately see or feel if something is wrong. Off-label use, we've heard about that also. They're not really happy, but there is no other solution. So, and the challenges, again, even if two children are born with the same basic heart failure, I'm just talking about heart because that's my subject, it doesn't mean that they have the same condition and require the same therapies. So, and what was important for one person to say is that GUTS patient needs to see a GUTS physician, not a cardiologist for adults. This is not a problem in Germany because we have physicians with this GUTS education. But I don't know about the other countries. I have the feeling that it's not the case in every European country. So, and the adult patient reported that even if he has grown up now and is an adult, he cannot take the same dosages as an adult with a non-congenital heart disease. So now I'm coming to the clinical trials. None of the parents was able to or willing to participate in a study for a new drug that was neither marketed for adults nor for children. The only exception would be, we were talking about in theory, so the only exception would be if soon death is inevitable and if there are no other options. And one adult patient stated, as we are all experienced and informed patients ourselves, they must have some pretty good arguments to get us on board, as we are taking these same drugs for years now and managed to get around with them somehow. So why should we change anything with additional risks? And the clinical trials for the adult drugs, the parents told me that if this means to continue the therapy with the drugs they already take, and if this means, or if this implies protocol weekly measurements, as we've heard with apps or online tools, all parents would be fine with it. And why is that? Well, it's pretty obvious, because they would have an additional confirmation that everything is still okay, that the child is doing fine, because they know that someone at the end of the app will check this data regularly. So this would be an add-on without additional risks. And some have said that it depends also on the personal commitment of the doctor. So they have pretty often done that already with them. And the doctor offered it, said, please send me every evening your data and I will check it. So obviously this seems to be happening somehow already. But there's also a but. The child needs to live at home, or at least must be old enough to do all the measurements himself. And it takes time to go to the centers. That's also, as we've heard, a problem. And there was a very interesting difference between the decision of a parent versus an adult. Maybe adult is not correctly, because then they are getting the adult dose, I guess. But the patient I was talking to was mentioning the critical time between 16 and 18, where they try to take their own decisions. And there's a difference, because parents always worry about, what if I have done in the past something differently? Would he be as worse as he is now? Because they are never informed enough, because obviously there is a lack of information for everybody. And if there would have been a second option, second opinion. So the parents prefer life over life quality. The teenager or young adults, in contrary, they want to improve their life quality, because they're getting depressed if the life quality is low. One mother told me that he sat very depressed in his room and said, I'm not allowed to do anything anymore. Every time I go to the heart center, they tell me I have to do less. So what am I still allowed to do? And so this shows clearly that teenagers or young adults are really motivated for new drugs, for new studies, for an improvement. The clinical endpoints, we've talked about these, so I'm not going to stress it. The incentives for the parents, they want to be involved and heard from the beginning. They want to be included, not excluded. They want a limited risk, well, at least not higher than it is already today. They always see an additional cost-free therapy for their child to relieve the side effects, because they also complain about water in the body or oxygen therapy, that this could be useful. What is also extremely important to parents or patients is a committed and communicative physician they trust and work with for years. It doesn't help a lot if you enter a heart center or a special center and get treated by a different physician every time you show up, because then you have to explain and re-explain every time the same thing. They prefer a face-to-face level, so they say sometimes it's really, if we come there in emergency cases and my own physician is not available, they have to really fight, and this is absolutely not necessary to get their child treated in the way they at least think it's correct. And what also would help, as most parents are organized in self-help groups, either via Facebook or within the clinical center they've met, it would be useful maybe to address these self-help groups as when looking for patients for a clinical study. And in the meantime, they could have mental support within themselves in the Facebook circle, for example. So definition of life quality, the patient said it was from good to poor. So good means to them they can do everything they want, apart, of course, from intensive trainings, and only have to pause from time to time. And poor is, for example, cannot attend regular schools or go to work. They have no healthy friends because they can't compete with them. This leads to isolation. We've heard that, and we've seen that in the movie. They observe deterioration in their friends with the same condition. And if you see your best friend that also suffers from PAH, see this friend dying, this leads to absolute fear and depression. They often have to disrupt, cut or short the activities, and this condition influences the whole family. Don't forget the siblings, that's also an important thing. So life quality, what are their wishes? And they are so simple that I had to write them down because it shocked me. I'm healthy, fortunately. Fortunately, I have a healthy daughter. And when this mother told me that her son just wants to go to the south, well, south for us is then Spain, for example, with their families by plane, that really struck me because I've never thought about this as a big issue. Or they want to get a driver's license. Or just go to McDonald's with friends without calculating the way, the time, the weather, and all other factors. Just live an uncomplicated life. Payment by health insurers, just briefly. They usually get paid, apart from Tracleer or Bosantan. That was declined 2 times, but at the 3rd time it was reimbursed. With the explanation that is also very funny because the reimbursement or the payment, health insurance has said the drug wouldn't work in the child. And if you get this told as a mother, this is really not nice. And sometimes they ask for additional money from the state to cover extra expenses, and sometimes it gets rejected or sometimes it gets acknowledged. So that's my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Christine. You said you would be the last lecturer, but we have one more person. He volunteered. He promised to be short. And that's Mark Turner. So, Mark, you are from Enpr-EMA. Maybe you can introduce yourself briefly, and then.
Thank you very much. It's very difficult to follow the most important session of the day, but I'm a neonatologist from the UK. I co-chair the European Network of Pediatric Research here at the agency with Irmgard Eichler, and I hope I've got something slightly new to add to what people have said. Our network includes more than 45 networks, national networks and specialty networks in Europe and multiple countries outside Europe. And I'd just like to share some of the experience we have with clinical research networks that may be relevant to this community, but also build on the experience of other communities. So networks can do a number of things that make life easier for drug development and hopefully easier for children. As we've seen, the PAH community can gather data, and that's really informative and very helpful. But to make that as good as possible, you need to use data standards that can then be submitted to FDA, for example, using CDISC. And that then allows you to validate criteria in a way that can be done quickly and easily. From a data perspective, that needs time and a setting to develop that, and often cash and in-kind contributions from industry. Your community can identify patients, but to do that, you need realistic studies with clear characteristics. And the best way to do that is to have contributions from the families, from children and young people at early stages in the design, so that you design the studies around what is feasible rather than find people to fit the studies that you've designed already. Networks can discuss prioritization, and networks, generally speaking, are very keen to do multi-arm studies, comparing multiple agents at the same time, preferably with a single control arm. And we hear about this in the type 2 diabetes community, the hepatitis C community. All sorts of communities want to do this. And it's not the not the clinicians or the families preventing this. What communities benefit from is having an honest broker who sets out a mandate, who provides an assurance that investment of time and energy by families and other stakeholders will yield useful results, but this needs meetings, which cost money, and I think benefit from a pre-competitive space, which is preferably done as a formal public-private partnership with clear rules that avoid conflicts of interest and allow people to work together. And I think the European Reference Network, ERN Lung, is a really good opportunity for that. And in neonatal practice, we have an example of an honest broker through the International Neonatal Consortium, Inc. or INC, which is funded by a number of companies with an interest in neonates, some of whom are represented today. And that honest broker is hosted by the Critical Path Institute. And we've had a number of work streams that have addressed neonatal issues that are analogous to what you've been talking about. Definition of conditions, definition of endpoints, common protocols that can be used for multiple companies. And that honest broker function is really helpful, and I suspect it would allow all these people to keep on working together in future. In the broader community, networks can help by promoting recruitment and trial management. Your community does it in skilled centres, but we've heard about the importance from Sweden and other countries of working with other centres that are not the skilled centres, because you need to have continuing care. You can't have a child covering half the country to come for every trial visit or every time they have an adverse event. You need to have cooperation at local healthcare levels, and networks can do that. Networks can speed up processes by providing stability and motivation for people to work together, and by having common costing processes, common templates for contracts, common confidentiality agreements. And all of these are relevant to multiple groups and can be done once, but then rolled out for diabetes or for Duchenne's or for pulmonary artery hypertension. Most importantly, networks can support children and young people in the design of studies and their implementation. And we've seen this happen in a number of conditions and also generically across conditions, that families can come together in a safe environment that gives them a voice, but which avoids some of the pressures of working directly for pharmaceutical companies. This does need resource for meetings, places to have them, time and travel, and does need a formal pre-competitive space, which again needs some investment. So the implications of experience in other groups are that there's an enormous value for having a pre-competitive space to discuss trials, to gather data that can be used in many settings. We've just heard about the value of sharing placebo data, about the value of working together, and that's best done with with legal agreements that can be agreed in advance so as to avoid any conflicts later on. And this is possible, but it does need some time, effort, and it does need some financial investment from sponsors. A pre-competitive space is what is needed for children and young people to be most effective, and we have a European network of young people's advisory groups who have done everything that we've just heard about in multiple specialties and can share those skills in a way that will make the most of people's time and energy. We also have the reference network, Lung, and all the European reference networks are working with all the research networks to have shared agreements and shared processes so that Duchenne's or Gaucher's disease or this condition can look to the sites to provide consistent support, so that each condition does not have to set up sites independently, that we can avoid repeated redundant effort. So pre-competitive space is really useful. Resources are necessary. An effective pre-competitive space needs to be managed professionally, otherwise it just causes problems, need meetings. And if you're going to have staff who can deal with multiple conditions, including this one, you need to have them ready in sites and trained and working to standard agreements so that they can run your trial as soon as it becomes available. So we do have clinical research networks that are available to do this in France, in Spain, in Italy, UK, the Netherlands, Belgium. There are sites that are ready to run whichever trials come along, and we need to bring those people together. Similar work is happening in the States. There are a number of networks. Most recently, the Institute for Advanced Clinical Trials for Children, IACT for Children, is up and running. The Innovative Medicines Initiative has a project costed at 135 million euro that is in final negotiation to set up sites that can deliver these studies for you and for all the other specialties. And of course, we've got the reference networks that we need to work with. So from the perspective of clinical research networks, we'd suggest that you need to set up a public-private partnership. I think implementing what we've just heard does need a formal legal agreement that is not limited to the companies, but involves other people as well, because the publicly funded registries can contribute in exactly the same way, but that needs to be done transparently so that intellectual property is respected and people know where they stand. One opportunity you have is the International Neonatal Consortium, funded by some of these companies here and others, run by the Critical Path Institute, and Janssen, Pfizer, Lilly have a lot of experience in that, so that might be one opportunity. You could work with other networks in the design and implementation of studies, and Canadians have just funded something. I hear rumors that the Japanese are about to fund something, and Australians are working in this way as well. For the most important people in the room, we have the International Children's Advisory Network that covers children and young people. This is an international with chapters in the States and in many European countries. And we have the European Network of Young People's Advisory Groups that brings young people together, gives them the skills they need to make useful contributions, and then supports them in doing this. So all of these options are available, and all of these groups are looking forward to hearing from you. One concrete suggestion is that the industry members of the IMI2 project, and I'm looking at Janssen, Pfizer, Bayer, GSK, and Lilly, who are in the room, could propose that this condition is the basis of one of the studies that we'll be using to pilot the IMI2 network. So we're looking to industry. The FPA consortium has promised to provide 3 or 4 studies to road test the network we're all going to build together. And from what everyone said, this would be the ideal condition to run a novel study, maybe multi-arms, maybe coming up with some of the very clever statistical designs that can provide innovation and concrete results. So this is very much in industry's hands, because the resources need to come, but we have everybody else ready to work with you. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark, for this nice talk about networks. I think that may be part of the future indeed, but I think we should start with it now. So thank you very much. Okay, then I think we will come to the discussion. I think we have maximum of an hour and a quarter, so I think we really have to structure the discussion after what we have heard this morning. And I would like to start a discussion by asking whether we, based on what we have discussed this morning, really think that we need efficacy study in pediatric PAH patients. And if we answer that question positive, I think we can discuss further what design we then think should be needed. And we can address a number of issues which have been raised. And then I think we can also discuss about the endpoint. And if time is also there, we can discuss about what populations and when we want separate populations and when not. But first of all, I would like to start a discussion with, do we really think that efficacy studies are needed in pediatric PAH patients? And if yes, why? So maybe we can start this question by putting it to my neighbor, Norman, who I think has some pronounced ideas on this, on which part of them you might have heard already in the past. But Norman, can you start this question? And then I would certainly like to have your response.
Good, good. No, I'm happy to do that. And I'll argue with you about what we should actually try to accomplish this afternoon. These drugs, and we've got now, 6 or 7 or 8 of them, in adults, have effects that range from small to minuscule. And so the development programs in adults are reasonably large because it takes a fair number of people in order to resolve this small effect. The drugs themselves are not disease modifying. They are all doing something to, for the most part, addressing pulmonary artery pressure. They're vasodilators. The symmetry of the disease does not in any way help you figure out whether or not the mechanisms that are in play in adults giving rise to these small effects are going to play out as you'd hope in younger patients. So there's not much question that we need better data to inform the use of these drugs in children. I think it was Dr. Strait's talk that really identified for me where our major problem is. It's in this 0.01 patients recruited per month per site. And if you can't fix that, we don't have a discussion about endpoints or trial design or anything else. You've got to be able to figure out where that problem came from. Is it because there's some inappropriate incentive to sign up for a trial in which you don't think you can actually recruit or don't plan to recruit? Is it at that level? Or is there some other cultural problem associated with recognizing when it's appropriate to try and get better data? And that's where I think we need to try and figure out what needs to be done here. The effects of the drugs are likely to be small in kids. It's going to take real trials to detect them reliably. How do we get patients enrolled in trials?
Why do you want to confirm it when it has been, the efficacy has been confirmed in adults? What's the specific reason that you want to have it confirmed in children? What makes you ask that? I mean, if we have so many problems with recruitment, because we can, of course, extend the recruitment, but that will be...
Probably some other people, Lin Yao or some others, can talk about a broader experience of getting drugs moved from the adult setting to children. But at least in the small group of drugs that the cardiovascular and renal drugs division has been supervising, we've had failure after failure of taking a drug that works in adults, more or less trying to get the exposure matched in children, and finding out that we're not getting the outcome or the PD effect that you'd expect, because kids are not little adults. It's a matter of trying to figure out when are the mechanisms that underlie the treatment effect in adults. What state are those things in kids? They mature over time, but often aren't quite what you'd expect them to be based on the adult data. So that's why you got to do something to make this transition.
Then it's only the number of patients which are available which determines what kind of studies you...
But there are plenty of patients. The problem here is not that this disease is so rare you can't find patients for this. The problem is they're not signing up for the trials.
Okay, yeah, I think you're clear. Maybe, yeah, maybe I can just ask Daniel and Amani, and then we will. Daniel, you want to add anything to this?
Not really. I agree fully with what Norman said. These are not little adults. And you have to be able to prove when you have a very small difference that this really is going to work in kids. And also in kids, you're going to have another problem, that's maturation. What may work in the very young child may not work at another age and vice versa. I also heard today that this is not one disorder, that this is multiple disorders in pediatrics. There's idiopathic, there's the lung, someone else mentioned about the cardiac. So all of those are issues that need to be addressed when you're going to be putting a indication on a drug that you're saying is safe and effective for a population.
For the discussion, it might be good to start with the same indication, like for instance, idiopathic pulmonary. I mean, it's clear that for congenital heart disease, we will need separate studies. But Amani?
Yeah, I think our perspective is a bit different about the biological systems that work. And we have some confirmation when we did, for example, the sildenafil trial, that you have some confirmation from exercise capacity, you have some hemodynamics, and you have some other supportive data. So yes, we do not know if the biological systems are comparable based on, I do not know what is happening, but at least in the outcomes that we have seen in the one study, the one complete study that we have seen, we are convinced that things are running parallel, what is happening in the adults and what is happening in the pediatrics. Considering also that we are talking only about the vasodilators, whether it is PDF inhibitors or endothelin antagonists or prostanoids, I would argue that this can be extrapolated or whatever, like inferred, or, you know, we don't like to use the word extrapolated, but there is some argument to say that what have worked in the adults can work in the children, but maybe the dose, we need to find the right dose for that based on the same different parameters that we have measured in adults.
So for you, it's primarily a dose issue.
Yes, and I have to confirm it. I would not I stand behind that presentation. We cannot just find an exposure and say this is enough. We need to confirm it with some parameters.
Okay, so no PK only. Okay, Lynn.
So I have to say that the question was worded in a way that I think maybe was intended to be provocative. And so I think you've heard some provocative responses. So what I would say is that the issue is not necessarily when we say we need efficacy data, that you've got to have a double-blind, randomized, placebo-controlled trial of 10,000 patients over 10 years. I think we've already demonstrated that that's not going to happen in probably any of our lifetimes. But I think what you're hearing from the group here is that we don't have enough confidence about the effect in adults to say clearly that all we really need to do is get a dose in a child and we're done. And I think that the questions that remain unanswered that give us concern about that are the very questions we need to have answered in order for these programs to move forward. So what that means is that, you know, okay, so maybe the time has passed. Maybe we lost an opportunity to find more rigorous or robust data to support PD effects in adults that we could use to support the PD effect in children. But we heard a presentation today that describes an actual PD effect that seems to be very robust. And so now we have to figure out, put the pieces together. I think that's what we're asking now is, I believe that we do need efficacy information. I don't think that anybody up here said that we need, again, randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled trials. But we need efficacy information, and we need to have efficacy information that will help us bridge what we know to what we don't know from adults to children.
Some hands. Who was first? Okay, Professor Gallier.
I would like to challenge two concepts about the drugs in adults. We do not know if these drugs are disease modifiers, I know, but it's the same for beta blockers and angiotensin converting enzyme inhibitors in heart failure, but I use them. And the effect, yes, may be small in randomized control studies with the primary endpoint you use, 6-minute walking test, for example. However, the meta-analysis of the 6-minute walking test data showed the risk reduction for mortality of 44% in a period of 3 months. And the historical survival of idiopathic PAH patients in the NIH registry was 35% at 5 years. Now, idiopathic PAH patients in current registries have a survival of 75% at 5 years. So I believe that the current treatment strategy in adults is effective, keeping into consideration that this is a very severe and chronic disease. Now, the translation to the children requires some work. I completely agree. But given the big difficulties of recruiting those patients, of using the placebo, we need to find, this is what I strongly believe, a compromise to show some efficacy, to understand the difference in pharmacokinetic, and is what I'm expecting by this meeting.
So, Dunbar Ivy again. Just a comment and to think back on the sildenafil starch trial and what we learned. I think, you know, a couple of things. Number one, it was very difficult to enroll even then. It was a 5-year trial to enroll those patients. That was a different era where we did have placebo versus monotherapy, and I don't think we're able to do that again. I think, you know, back to the question is, do we need efficacy? My personal opinion is yes, but my challenge would be, is it at the same level? Is it one study with a p-value of less than 0.001? That was a criticism of Dr. Rubin saying, well, we can't approve a drug with one study with a p-value less than 0.05. So I agree with Dr. Gallier that we do need some sort of compromise. We can't expect to do studies, and we've tried to enroll patients in these studies, and we're not going to have, it's going to be very difficult to get 200 patient studies anymore. Why aren't these trials enrolling? And I think Jerry had some very important comments. When you approach a family, it's very difficult to do placebo, even if they're on background, number one. Number two, if it's a drug that's already studied, right or wrong, the parents know what drugs are approved. And so if the drug is already approved, they want to be treated with those drugs. They don't want to enter a placebo trial if they know that, pick a drug that's already approved in adults. So they don't want placebo, they don't want a cath. I personally, I'm speaking across many areas, but I think the withdrawal design is very challenging to convince a parent that, you know, if you responded to a drug, we're going to withdraw an effective, quote unquote, therapy even for a short period of time in this disease. So I understand that it's an intriguing concept and may lead more quickly to an answer, but I think that's going to be very challenging. So I think...
now you are saying what kind of studies you don't want, but...
Well, I personally...
If you go to the positive side...
I think the positive side would be, a negative first. So I don't think... We've tried very long to find a surrogate for a primary endpoint. I don't think we will, to be honest. So I think we should look for something that directly shows how a patient feels or functions. And actigraphy is very new. I'm not sure that it will work, but I think if we can show directly rather than indirectly that the patients are feeling or functioning better, even though that's a new era for us in terms of...
Yeah, maybe we should focus on the design first.
So,
and then
I think to go directly there rather than to try to say, let's see if we can prove that echo estimates, not direct measures of pulmonary vascular resistance or pressure or whatever, their estimates, let's try to prove that echo would be a primary endpoint. Let's try to prove that MRI would be a primary endpoint. We're not going to do cath, so we're not even sure that's the right one. So rather than trying to spend a lot of time trying to find surrogates, let's look at something that looks at how they feel and function, and then focus on that.
I think there was a hand also.
Yeah.
Okay,
But-
yeah.
Okay, so Marek Mido, member of the pediatric committee. I'm from Poland, and I would like to return for the why to the last two presenters, because we are talking about the need for the more data on efficacy, especially in the youngest children. The problem is that on one of the slides, James Strait shown us that in fact the very slow enrollment is exactly the same for the independent on the type of the study, the double-blind control, as well as for PK safety study. That's something which is difficult to understand. Why is so difficult to enroll children into the just PK safety studies? This is the first comment. And the second, Christina Dehn showed us that in Germany, the parents, they are against the clinical trials. They don't want to be enrolled into the clinical trials. And the problem is that, as we know, there is also the responsibility of the physicians, of us, to ask if they prefer to get the access to the non-authorized drugs, to use off-label if there is, in case of the products authorized in adults already, or to get real development in children. So I think that is something which we need to work together, the clinicians, regulators, and also the industry, to explain what is the real benefit to take part in the development. And I would like to use example from completely another disease, the neurological diseases. As you know, during the several months, the nusinersen was studied very intensively in Europe and in the States for the children with spinal muscular atrophy. And it was enormous demand of parents to be enrolled to these studies. That's the difference. And I don't know how we can explain that for the chronic conditions, sometimes genetically determined. It's completely different approach from parents. Is it a mistake of us, of physicians, or the mass medias? I don't know.
There was just a hand, please.
Thank you. So, Shaheen Mouladeen, I'm a pediatric cardiologist looking after children with pulmonary hypertension in the UK, and also enroll into some studies. So some thoughts about the comments about challenges to enrollment. I think it's not, my observations for what it's worth, it's not just about the study design, although that is part of it. It's about the environment in which the studies are running. So I think if you're enrolling into a study for a drug which has now been approved and is widely available and used in different countries, and the study question you're enrolling, you're consenting patients for is patients make rational decisions. So if they perceive the study question is that we're doing this trial because it's necessary for regulatory approval, they don't necessarily see that as the most important question for their participation. They have to, my observation is they have to feel that there's a potential benefit to them or their cohort. Not a direct benefit for the patient, but a benefit for their cohort. So it's not just to tick a box. And that's an important reason why people might not want to enroll in the study. For studies perhaps to have a better enrollment, if if the pediatric studies were happening earlier in the lifespan of the drug, before wide rollout of the drug, that might address this issue. So it's about equipoise, because I think patients and families, there is no equipoise in their mind that the drugs work, and there is no doubt that without drugs, outcome is not great. So if the patient doesn't have equipoise when they're signing the consent form, they're not going to enroll.
We hear from the patients. No.
I just wonder if can we afford to do basic research for special children drugs? And if yes, if we can afford to develop a special child drug, what are we going to do until we have it, which takes a minimum of 10 to 20 years if we get the funds for it. So these 10 to 20 years, in the meanwhile, I think that we would like to have studies on approved medicines for adults to see if they work. And I always hear about endpoints and about, is the drug working? That means that the patient is getting better. And I have to say that we're already very happy if the patient is stabilized. Doesn't mean that it has to be better. If it goes to chronicle and is stabilized, we are very happy with that. But we do not want to wait that the industry brings up millions and then it takes 10 to 20 years until we maybe have a drug. So we want to have something now. Okay. And be safe.
Yeah, but safe is always a relative thing. I mean, Lynn, and then you, please. You want, then you.
So, I think that the comments that I just heard from our colleague who's a clinician in UK, and the comments I've heard from the other clinicians and academicians in the room is very interesting to me. So, the slide that Cecile put up on and the comments that I've heard from, our patients suggest to me that patients just want to have access and they trust their physicians to do the right thing, which is why they're willing to take anything as long as their physician said, we think this will help you. So I really want to dive deeper into this notion that we've lost equipoise here. Who's lost the equipoise here? And I think that, again, to Merrick's point, I feel like, where are we missing the boat here? Why are we having the problem enrolling either in a double-blind randomized placebo-controlled trial or a PK safety study? Where is the loss of equipoise? And is it really a lost cause? Are we saying now, forget it because we already, there's no way to enroll a trial because nobody believes that these drugs don't work?
I just want to come back what the colleague from Poland said. Maybe you misunderstood me. It's not that the parents are against clinical studies. That's not the case. It's not you, Lynn, but the colleague from Poland. The problem is that they don't want to set on the insecure horse. You know what I mean? It's like if you are treated, as Jerry said, more than less okay, then you would not say yes to a drug that is not approved neither for adults nor for children. So that's the critical point. That's the same. It goes into the same direction as with the placebo treatment, because parents just want not to do the wrong thing. That's the problem. They are not deciding for themselves. That would be a lot easier. They are deciding for a person they love more than themselves.
Following up on, I think. I think there are 3 points that came to my mind. Following up on what just said before, it's very difficult for some parents to go to a 10 or 20 page consent form. So they are not educated like we are educated. And I had parents in my clinic sitting after page 2. Thank you very much. We do what you suggest. Exactly that. Second point is it becomes more and more difficult for us as clinicians to go to REBs or IRBs to fight step by step, being told this pulmonary hypertension is a very dangerous disease. Why don't you want to do something, do research on these very very sick patients? So maybe a centralized REB for this patient population would be something that would be much easier for all of us. And part 3 is I was approached for a study in the past 24 months where the sponsor industry said we pay for the drug for 3 or 6 months, and then the patient is on its own. Did it work or didn't work, doesn't matter. You have to pay for it. I think these are hurdles that we have to overcome.
Thank you. Christoph Mahle, pediatric cardiologist from Austria and former PDCO member. I'm just listening to this discussion, and I think the point that's being put back and forward is, do we need efficacy data? I think we all agree that we need, but I think the more critical point is how much efficacy data do we need given the adult data that are available? And I think it comes down essentially to describing, and I think Amani said that earlier this morning, describing better, given again the understanding of the dose exposure response relationship that we know from adults, how much data do we need to see whether this dose exposure response relationship is different in children and whether this affects the benefit risk ratio? And I think this comes down to we probably don't need placebo-controlled trials comparing patients not receiving the drug to those receiving the drug, but rather looking at different dose levels that could be well described by prior modeling and simulation to account for developmental differences in drug disposition. And I think those, for patients receiving different dose levels for a limited period of time, this might be much more acceptable.
The question indeed is, why do you want these studies? Is it primarily for dosing or for something else? But so
well, but then if you just to, if you correlate that to clinical endpoints, then you might also be able to describe whether any exposure or PD measures are also correspond to clinical endpoints. And just one last word to clinical endpoints. I think in the setting of a confirmatory trial where we want to have an independent proof of concept in children, there we would have to have one defined primary endpoint. But in the setting where we essentially just want to confirm what we believe to know from adults, it might well be possible to have several endpoints observed at the same time and look at the correlations rather than, because we apparently don't have a full understanding of what would be the most responsive endpoint. I don't know what the statisticians say.
Well, I would point out again that in development program after development program, a whole series of pediatric dose response studies for the antihypertensives did not show a statistically significant effect. You could not find a slope in study after study. And the only evidence that you were on the top of the dose response in those studies was to do a withdrawal study. That was the only way you could tell the drugs were effective. Didn't tell you, turns out, exactly where you needed to be because you didn't have any data that was not on the top of the exposure response. But study after study failed there because well-meaning people who thought they could specify a reasonable dose range could not in fact do it. So if you're going to do a dose response study where a dose is not placebo, somebody's got to end up on a dose that's low enough that it's pretty darn close to placebo, or the trial's not going to show you anything.
Thank you very much. I'd like to address Lynn's comments and concerns, which I think are important in this condition, but quite generic as well. And I think that there are two concepts which lead to an implication for me. The two concepts are the quantum of evidence and path dependence. The quantum of evidence to change clinical practice is different from the quantum of evidence for regulatory concerns. So the clinicians will build up a rationale based upon what they've seen as they treat people, particularly if they've got shared adult pediatric practice, and they may gradually escalate downwards depending on what's going on. And once they've got that, that assurance that it's worth trying something, then they'll try it. But then once they've got a feeling for what they're comfortable with based upon their experience and going to conferences and reading the published literature, then they set up what's a secure way of working for them and their patients. And once you're in a secure set of working, that then involves some legacy costs to move out of it, because you know what you're doing, you know what the tolerances are, you know what your dose changes will lead to on your echo findings. So you're in a position of safety, which then allows you to make therapeutic recommendations. So the question is, moving from the clinical frame of assurance into the regulatory frame of assurance has a cost. You're in a well of safety, and you need to somehow push people over that well. And sort of the free energy required, I'm not sure that many clinicians understand the benefits of regulatory assurance on that. And certainly in many countries, in the UK at least, we're very well served by clinical pharmacists. We're very well served by specials companies that give us product quality without necessarily having a full marketing authorization. So the security you can have within the clinical framework is quite a lot. And then persuading people to jump out of one pocket into another pocket does take quite a lot of time and energy, which for the marginal benefits you gain from discussing some of these outcomes may not be worthwhile to the rational clinician. So my implication from that is that we need to start where we are, because that quantum of evidence and the path dependence it leads on to make it much more difficult to start off with a blank sheet. So the suggestion to move from the baseline, whichever your baseline is, to something else, I think has a lot of strength going for it, because it meets the clinicians' needs, it meets the family's needs, and I guess the clever thing to do is then make it to help the regulators with their decisions.
I want to ask about this withdrawal of drug, because I'm not sure if I understood it correctly. Does it mean that the patients are enrolled then, and that the drug is withdrawn after a certain time? Did I understand that correctly?
That's how you do a withdrawal study.
Yeah, the problem is that the parents obviously don't know that beforehand, if it's withdrawn or not. Do they? No, it's like randomized, or what is it?
That's right. You'd randomize somebody to continue on drug or go to placebo for a short period of time.
So I'm not sure if parents would be so happy with this solution, because it's like Jeopardy, what you're playing.
Okay, so
Just for the withdrawal trial, I think it's a difference with hypertension in children that may have a long-lasting effect, but in the immediate term, it doesn't matter too much to the patient whether you withdraw. But for a life-threatening disease, I agree with you. I don't think it can be acceptable.
I'm not sure to understand the story of the withdrawal, because my personal experience in pediatric trials about withdrawal was about withdrawal because of failure on the basis of the main endpoint. So it did not then raise any ethical issue, because when there was either an adverse event or a failure on the main endpoint, it was quite acceptable for the parents to withdraw the trial. So it's not an idea, it's just a reaction to a new event in the follow-up of the kids during the trial.
Yeah, I'm Ángeles Alonso. I'm a cardiologist, and I work in the Scientific Advice Working Party. I'm listening to everybody, and I understand what is happening now. I have to tell you that in the last 2 years, we advise the companies for the clinical development program, and I guess that some of you advise the companies how to do it. And they come with completely different trial designs. So I really don't know what is the questions that the clinicians want to ask. Some of you're pretty confident that the drugs that work for adults work for children, and so the minimum efficacy breach. Others, they don't. Other clinicians in the same field, they don't. There's a big lack of equipoise within the clinicians. And they really, not only because of their treated patient, but for their own knowledge, They want to know for their own knowledge registry and their own work what this drug will going to do in clinical worsening, for example, which was important. So I think that the first way to go is you, the experts, is we are in this domain. What do we want? Do we agree that these drugs work for adults, all of us, and we will require the minimum, or we don't? And it may depend of the mechanism of action of the drug. It will may depend that in different age, you need a different development program. But you need to really solve that lack of equipoise within you.
I'm considering really the question of enrollment. I think we have to remember that these patients, these children and their parents, know that their life is limited. And most of them are desperately anxious to get every minute of good they can out of it. And they don't want to go to hospital unless they have to. And so, I think enrollment to get perhaps a marginal benefit is out of the question. They don't want PK and PD studies done because they don't want extra needles. They want to think of themselves as, they know they're not normal. Of course they know they're not normal. But they want to put that on the back burner and get on with whatever quality of life they can maximize for the moment. If something comes out of adult studies, which is a game changer, it's not a modulation of the 3 pathways we modulate at the moment, then they'll be queuing up to be enrolled. I think it's because they can see from their own contacts, pediatric contacts, and they look at the adult scene and they see no major step forward. So they're not queuing up to be enrolled. If we produce something that was a real game changer, you wouldn't have a problem.
Small steps.
And this is difficult.
Yeah.
It's very difficult.
It's very not often a major game changer. That's the problem. Yeah. Yes, Marie.
My comment will not be real science, but I want to tell you what happens in clinics. I told you 30 years ago, my patients, most of them died. So I couldn't do anything. Now, 30 years later, I'm trying to build a transition clinic, which means I need to transition my patients to the adult clinic. So I can understand that maybe the drug are not working, but something has changed. So maybe it's just that I take care of my patient better. I don't know, or I'm very lucky in my center, but I'm transitioning pediatric patient to adults, which is sometimes very difficult, to tell you the truth, with chronic diseases. So I'm transitioning these patients, and when they go to the adult field, I'm not sure they change disease. So they have the same disease, but now they're taken care by adults because they survived. So this is what happens in clinics. So now we can try to do our best to have these drugs approved or not, used or not, but this is what happens in clinic when we take care of these patients. So we need also to see that. If you're a parent, you know that because they see that. There is one example here. I had a patient a few weeks ago. She came to the clinic in the ICU with a huge pericardial effusion. If you look at the data, she should be dead. She's doing gym now with triple combination therapy. So something is happening, and we need I agree with most of my colleagues, we need to find a compromise. But that would be really bad that we don't find a compromise to help these children. So we need to think
compromise with regards to the requirements of the study.
Yes, and I think the compromise is, the word is really the compromise. I think we are all trying to explain that something happened. So if you tell us that the drugs are not working in adults, that probably solves the problem. But if the drugs are working in adults, I think there is pediatric patients that become adult, they continue the treatment, and they're doing well.
What would be the minimum for you?
I think the same as our colleague from Austria said, we need to find just a good PK/PD, as also Amani said, and compare with some data of the adult trial with a similar setting and similar drug, and say, yes, this is exactly, and we can extrapolate and use that in children. I'm doing that since many years, and I can present you some of my patients.
You're not optimistic that you can recruit more patients?
I mean, recruitment is, I told you before about the PIP. You told me we should not discuss about the PIP. But the problem is that if we start the program and the drug will be available 15 years later, I'm sorry, I will treat my patient. I don't want to see my patient dying, and I have a responsibility towards the parents.
You are treating now patients off-label or not?
I have to.
Yeah. Okay.
The initial question was, what are the requirements for efficacy and what are our requirements? And we're treating the questions like as if we have to give the same answer for all of the different drugs. And in my opinion, the answer may be different for different groups of drugs, different for endothelin receptor blockers and for other drugs. I think the requirements may depend on what do we know from adults. If we have a very nice large-scale controlled trial with morbidity mortality data, the requirements for children should not be as high. Just find the dose and maybe some safety data, and that would be an appropriate way. On the other hand, if we get from the adult data concerns, let's say about mortality or about efficacy, then the requirements for the children should be higher. In addition, transferring the right dose from the adult program to the children may be easier in drugs where you have a fixed dose, as opposed where even in the adults you have an individual dose finding that is based on tolerability. Is tolerability in the adults in a 20-year-old patient the same as tolerability in a 3-year-old patient? So if there are concerns about what is the right, can you transfer the dose from adults to the children because the dosing is based on tolerability, that may increase the requirements. So in general, I think we cannot give one answer regarding the requirements on efficacy and safety and dose finding, but the requirements should depend on what drug we are dealing with.
So, yes.
Yes. I just want to echo a couple of things that I believe are important. It's going to be short. First, recruitment. I think that what James Strait showed us is absolutely what's happening and what we're facing and what we will face in the future. It means that the recruitment for one study that I saw that was 4 per month is completely unrealistic in pediatrics. All the other studies recruited 0.1, 0.001, 0.01, and this is a fact of life. The reason for that are multiple, and James showed that very, very nicely. One of the reasons is that since the availability of the drugs on the market, there's a pulverization of pulmonary hypertension centers. Basically, any physician who treats adults and maybe also children, whether cardiologist or not, has a little knowledge on pulmonary hypertension, will start those patients on sildenafil. And we have, I wouldn't say on a weekly basis, but surely on a monthly basis, children who are coming to us who have inappropriate use of PAH drugs because they had transient pulmonary hypertension. That's a second fact that we need to deal with. And it really reflects the level of culture for rare diseases and also probably clinical trials, especially in the pediatric population, because we have here, many of my pediatric colleagues are experts in their fields. We do not have any representative, I think, of the general treating pediatrician who sees 1 or 2 of these kids maybe in a career or in 5 to 10 years' time, who would be keen to use the drugs probably inappropriately. So that's another problem. Last thing, the role of the networks of expertise is highly important because this is within these networks of expertise that you have, I would say, everything. The clinical quality, the scientific quality, the volume, and also the culture of clinical trials, which is something we should not underestimate. Your barrier to get any patient in a clinical trial is going to be lowered. The more you do, the lower will be the hurdle. So these aspects probably would lead us to again, have some sort of pragmatic approach and consider prospective registries, control registries as a way to improve the knowledge and also perhaps in conjunction with clinical trials, have an idea on the efficacy of the drugs in the pediatric population if this is what some of the regulators want.
Registries have not been very successful in helping us get drugs registered. In some ways it can be helpful in the post-marketing surveillance, but in registration, I must say, it has been extremely difficult. But I don't know whether anybody has an opinion about using registries for clinical trials, but I don't know whether industry has done it. James, do you have a... You mentioned it, but you are not too optimistic, or...
No, well, I should say that I think there's a lot of interest in it, and those are exactly the sorts of things that we're listening to today, to hear about what you, the regulators, would think about something like that. I think there's been quite a bit of work groups and things like that about really innovative ways to do this, and I think it actually presents a real opportunity. Just to add one more point, too, I mean, I think what we're hearing from everybody are a lot of good ideas about really bringing the best drugs forward. I think what we really struggle with in industry is we're sort of dealing with the world we have and not the world we want. And we're trying to figure out how do we do what needs to be done in this world of recruitment rates, of all the things we've described as challenges. So, but I want to thank everybody for a lot of good ideas that we've heard today.
Sue?
Yes. I would like to, perhaps from the discussion we are having now and as well from the preparation, I just would like to try to put forward to the audience where it seems that we are. So I think there are big gaps in knowledge related to the pathophysiology. And I don't think that we are going to have the answer to the question related to pathophysiology by the clinical trial, because you need to study maturation and you need to study over a long time, and that's probably something that could be better addressed by the mean of registries and pulling some data, and that could help to increase our knowledge and have better as well than from the data, better disease model, and then more reliable prediction. Then I hear that there is a problem of enrollment and partly because of the lack of key POIs and the off-label use that is already ongoing. And I just feel that if we have, and as well, there do not seem to be a need to have efficacy being demonstrated in a way that you need to power the study for a primary endpoint related to efficacy. So if we could switch the scientific question of interest for the purpose of licensing, instead of do we want to test if the drug is working in a child, yes or no, but rather we would like to understand what is the best dose in the child, and then have PK/PD studies and find an appropriate design that could help us to better understand the drug and the dose response to put it on the market, and then have a good post-marketing tools to accumulate this knowledge with regard to the pathophysiology. That would be helpful, but it seems to be that we are struggling with the pathophysiology and in a way, and the drugs on the other way, and we are not going to have these two answers by one trial. And I think everybody needs to compromise, yes, and here I speak only under my name, but I think if we want to compromise, we need to have the question around the dose, to have a design that is going to help us to have good results related to the dose response, that we have good slope and that we can interpret this data, and then we need to have better post-marketing tools. But if we don't combine these two aspects, I think we will be left. And another very important parameter that goes back to the PIPs. So yes, you need to file the PIP early, and this is not going to change. But I think we can discuss the objective of the design, and then the initiation of the study is another point. And yes, once the drug is on the market, clearly we are back to the off-label use and difficulties in recruitment, but we have a very narrow time window between the time we understand that a drug is working in adults and the time of licensing in adults, where we can already initiate the pediatric studies and where there could be some interest for the patient to be enrolled and get earlier access to these drugs. And I think we shouldn't forget about that as well. That's it. Thank you.
Okay, no, you want to respond to that? Because the post-registration data, you think they are usable? I mean, we have to compromise maybe somewhere.
Well, first of all, let's recognize what our role as regulators really is here. It isn't to check a box or to ensure that a company gets some additional marketing exclusivity. That's not our purpose. Our purpose is to try and get information to prescribers that will inform the use of the drug in a pediatric setting. And it's, you know, there's a point, there's room for compromise, and I think we've talked about some forms of compromise. You know, we never ask for more than one study ever, so we obviously think there's some bridging that gets done. We've expressed an interest in, all of us have expressed an interest in conceivably informing use based on a biomarker and not a real outcome, although an outcome, you know, outcome data, whether it's patient-reported outcomes or disease progression, that would be good too. So I think there is a fair amount of compromise here. But at some point, and I would assert that just looking at trajectories of patients in a non-randomized setting, I think that's well beyond the place where you're actually generating useful information for this purpose.
You don't believe in putting information in the SMPC without at least approving it in 4.1 or 4.2.
Yeah, so this is an interesting place where Amani and Eliza and I have been having an interesting discussion. I don't think it's unreasonable in a setting where you don't have the information that you'd really like to have. I don't think it's unreasonable to provide prescribers with something. You know, here's enough information that if you think this might work, here's how you might get the exposure in the right range. I don't think that's crazy to do. It is not what we at FDA do. We have taken the tact of saying that if you do that, you are in fact encouraging the use, even though you don't have any basis for it. And for that,
any is, I think, you have a basis, but
well, you don't know that that's a strategy that's going to lead to an effective therapy. So you can't on the basis of matching the PK recommend the use. You can say, if you've decided to use it, this is a way to get the exposure in a certain range.
no, but I think everybody agrees that PK in itself, then it would be PK/PD, I think. But
yeah, well, that's fine, and as you know, as we've discussed, we're about in the same place with respect to using PD data to make the bridge from adults to children.
But then it either you get the indication or you don't get the indication.
Well,
then there's no, then it's no information.
If you have concluded that you know, there's a PD effect in adults that you think has some relationship to the outcome, the actual clinical outcome in adults, we've said you can get an indication in children by demonstrating that you can achieve the PD effect in children. So that gets you approval. It doesn't get you a claim exactly that you affect disease progression, and it probably doesn't get you a claim exactly that you know what the effect on exercise is going to be. But it is an acceptable bridge from adult data to children.
And what PD data? We haven't really discussed endpoint yet. Are you thinking then more on invasive? Are you putting then the barrier high? I mean, it's.
Look, I mean, it's unfortunate that we don't now have a well-developed, non-invasive way to get pulmonary vascular resistance. And if it turns out that there is a way with a somewhat noisier metric to get similar data, but because it's non-invasive, it's easier, you need a little bit larger sample size to get, confidence that there's a real effect there. But if you could satisfy those things, I think we'd accept something other than invasive hemodynamics.
What about exercise? I mean, you showed a correlation.
If you can show exercise, you've got no problem, right? You can label an exercise effect. That's how most of these drugs got approved in the first place.
And then you could do without the invasive measurement.
Then who would care?
Okay. Yes. The microphone, please.
I want to pose this to our colleagues and clinicians, academics, and to the industry. Because I think really what I've heard as I'm putting it together is there a way we can cobble together something that would provide sufficient evidence of effectiveness that as clinicians, you would be okay with saying, okay, this is something that we can do, this is something we can stand behind. And if it was, as I heard, some sort of endpoint that gives us reassurance in more than one front, for example, so that there is evidence that a patient feels better, that there's evidence on a hemodynamic marker, that there is evidence in a functional test of some type, walking or whatever we can rely on in those patients who can. Is that the kind of efficacy that is important enough, again, for clinicians who are in the room, who are going to be enrolling their patients, to say, yeah, we can get behind that? Because I think we're trying to put together a story that gives us more confidence, but not make it so onerous that nobody will ever enroll in it.
I used for the first time.
Okay, great. So thank you, Craig Kinchin, Eli Lilly. So really appreciate the dialogue today. This is something that we've been working on for quite some time now and sort of banging our heads against the wall trying to figure out how to do things both in PK and placebo-controlled studies. I watched during the break, many of you know my colleague Bao Li, who has probably called you frequently as we try to enroll patients in trials and talks to you regularly about individual patients. A patient who might be willing to change therapy in 6 months to go into a PK trial. So this really is an issue of small patient numbers in a disease state where you then have to convince a patient and their family to go to a clinic often. In the case of a PK study, especially for young children, to get multiple sticks for a drug that they're already on, or in some cases, we want you to change the therapy that you've been using and that you think has been working in order to enter even a PK study. So this is an issue of individual patients. And so what we're really looking for from an industry standpoint is What is that endpoint that allows us to be able to enroll a smaller number of patients, a realistic number of patients, where we can demonstrate efficacy? And right now, the endpoints that we're having to use, 6-minute walk, clinical worsening, you simply can't get the number of patients that you need in order to demonstrate efficacy to any reliable degree. And so if anyone has that new endpoint, we'd certainly be willing to try it. So I think in order to take a step forward, you need to do something to improve the confidence in your endpoints. Is that sharing placebo-controlled data or placebo data so that you can correlate the echo parameters with 6-minute walk, with hemodynamic parameters? Is it registry so that you can look at multiple endpoints? If you started testing actigraphy and you correlated it with other endpoints of interest over time, but it takes that, because right now, if you ask a company to start a new trial right now to have efficacy and safety data, the number of patients that you're going to need is going to be more than you're able to recruit. The slide that James showed is there's remarkable consistency over time in how terribly low that recruitment rate is. So it's not an issue of effort. It's not like one company is trying really hard and another company is not trying. All of the companies are trying extremely hard. You know how much that the effort is there. So if we cannot pretend that if we simply try harder, we'll get a different response. We need a different endpoint that will allow us confidence to do these studies. And so I think whatever the mechanism is, whether it's registries, whether it's efforts to do better validation, whether it's finding a new endpoint, we have to do that in order to take a step forward, because otherwise, in 5 years, we will be in the exact same position.
Very clear statement, I think.
Just a quick addition to your comment about enrollment. Again, and I don't want to get into too many specifics, but if a patient is on a drug that is FDA approved and you're asking them to stop the drug or to switch another drug to enroll in a trial when the drug is already approved, they're not going to do it. So I've tried many times. They will not do it. So that design is not going to work very well.
But can we do better on endpoints? I mean, do you have a can we do composite or combine, or do you have any suggestion? I mean, we have, of course...
to combine 4 surrogates and as a combined endpoint doesn't make sense to me when none of them are validated. That's why I think we should look for something more direct. But that's, my colleagues should answer, and this gentleman has been trying to raise his hand.
More direct? What do you mean?
Well, like how they feel and function, actigraphy or walk or something, rather than trying to prove that NT-proBNP is going to be,
think you need less patients then? If you
think
do that,
so.
I mean, if you take we have heard how patients are being monitored and what they appreciate themselves, and do you think that's a way to move forward to more to the patient-reported outcomes? Do you think that's viable in terms of methodology and everything?
I think it's viable, but as Dr. Humpel was saying, sometimes the perception of how a child is doing is very different for the parent than the child.
Yeah, so then it's not so sensitive. Yeah. Yes. Yes, please, Mark. Sorry.
I'd like to answer Lynn's question. I'd like to propose an answer at least, and the answer is yes, if we do 2 things. The first most important thing is to ask the children and young people, because if you find things that are acceptable to children and young people, then that gives you a start. So I think everyone else is making lots of useful suggestions, but we need to start off with listening to young people. And we have the skills in the pediatric community to do that, and listen to what people say and turn what people want into things that work. That has been done in other disease areas, so we need to do that. And secondly, then you need to work collaboratively as a community with investigators, with companies, to gather the data that then validates those endpoints, so that you know that's what people want and you know it'll give useful information. I think if you do those 2 things, that increases the chance that you can overcome the the addiction to their own opinions that clinicians have if you give them a valid alternative that's based upon families and data.
I think that's clear. Yes, please.
Well, several people have addressed combined endpoints, and I think if we do what clinicians do every day when they treat these patients or assess their patients, they essentially look at the combination of aspects, asking patients how they feel. They look at the echo, but not at a single parameter, but a combination of parameters in the echo and some other parameters, laboratory parameters. If it was possible to combine that into a score, and I wonder whether existing registry data would be available to kind of find parameters that can be correlated with survival, for example. And you've proposed some of this morning in your presentation from the Netherlands, and I wonder whether this could also include patient-reported data. This would probably be more reflective of what patients also would like to see. I wonder.
Yeah, to answer your question, I think you would need less patients if you go with whether it's actigraphy or mobile app, or if you use technology that way you can have continuous monitoring, you get a lot more data points than you have now, and that will allow you to use less patients. We've been hearing from the families. We heard from Dunbar, and we all seemed interested in that. But we're still talking about the typical endpoints, and I think we got to go back and listen to what they suggested to us.
Thank you. And to add to what you say, I think a very important parameter which came from the survey from the patient and the healthcare professional is the oxygen saturation level, which seems to be something where we could look into, because if we combine this with the actigraphy, we are getting into some kind of outcome that are becoming more and more sensitive, and if you have then the echo on top of it and all the rest that the experts are doing for the clinical practice, I think we could have something quite tangible. And I know it seems to be extremely challenging after the discussion of today, I can tell you, to find a compromise, but I really believe that we are not that far away to have something reasonable. And I think we have, as you said, we need to look at new technologies as well that we have. And all the patients said they would love to have an app to report some of the measures. And Patrick had in the previous version of his presentation has put an extract of the energy diary that he has built with the school, and this is amazing how it was structured. Patrick, I don't know if you're still here, but I think the patients are already doing this, and perhaps we should not reinvent the wheel completely, but use what the patients are doing already, not to add any burden, answer some of the questions they might have, and then probably it would be a bit more encouraging to the patient. If they feel that what they can add, they would engage more easily, I would think.
Just a quick comment. I'm not sure if everyone here is familiar, but the agency started a number of patient-focused drug development meetings, and one of them was on PAH, and the full report about what we heard at that meeting is available. So maybe take a look at those things.
Yeah, okay. Yes, please. State your name, please.
Hi, Elisa Thompson. I think the multiple endpoint issue is a very interesting one, but I actually wanted to circle back to the issue of equipoise in randomized controlled trials, and directing this question both to the patients but also to the academics. So I think various approaches were proposed to deal with this issue. One was to have essentially a baseline control. And I think you heard from Amani's presentation that in some settings, if the natural history of your biomarker or your outcome is well understood, and there's no reason to believe it would improve absent an intervention, that might be reasonable to do. I think we also heard discussion about exploring multiple doses in a trial as one way to get at the issue. But I don't think one thing that we haven't discussed, but I'd like to understand from you all, is a delayed start design using an early endpoint. And that type of design essentially is you randomize people to start the treatment now or maybe after after 2 weeks or 4 weeks. So in essence, everyone ultimately gets put on the therapy, but the difference is when you get put on it. And if you had an early readout, look at symptoms and your PD marker at ideally 2 weeks or maybe 4, whether that would be palatable or still you think that would that's something that's not something that patients or caregivers would be interested in doing, or the health caregivers.
Thank you. So I used for the first time the word compromise. I want to propose one. So 14 and above should be enrolled in the studies with adults. These are formally adults. From 0 to 13, I think we need to divide at the age of 7. But in this, from 0 to 13, we can use echo. We have already done this. 15 years ago, we did an echocardiographic sub-study of the BREATHE-1 study with bosentan, showing a very nice treatment effect, also calculating the cardiac output. Pressure is derived by echo, so we can calculate total pulmonary resistance, which is very close to PVRI. And
specialists say today that the echo is nice from one perspective of one center, but if you...
I'm talking about something that we have done. We have done a multi-center study with central reading, with echo, on 80 patients, showing treatment effect. This has been done in adults. And in children, echo usually is better done, is more easy to do. So this can be done. And in children between 7 to 13, you can enrich this echo data with, in some patients, right heart cath or 6-minute walking test in all. So you may have reinforcing data. I'm talking about non-randomized study, of course, because everyone involved in the area is saying that the placebo-controlled study in children when the drug is approved for adults is not feasible. There is no one who wants to enroll these patients or keep a patient on placebo. So this may be a reasonable compromise for us, for the prescribers, because we are not only academic, we are prescribers.
Okay, you are pointing.
Marlene's been very patient, been trying to talk for some
Marlene,
time.
I didn't see your hand raised. No, you.
I just have a slight suggestion because I see this recurring theme of recruitment problems, and I agree with most of the answers to this from a patient view that, if you struggle with this disease on a daily basis, I believe it's the last thing that you want to be reminded again through a study or something like that. So maybe a suggestion to help this problem is to, and I don't know how far this can go because I'm not a doctor, but maybe it might be easier to accumulate this data in a way where you do not remind the patient that they are in a study like this. For example, during the times that the patient is in the hospital anyways. So if there might be a way to do this, maybe even through a mobile app that seems a lot less invasive than telling somebody, okay, you have to go to the hospital now and have your blood taken or have a right heart cath done because of the study. But if you say, okay, this data is going to be collected anyways when you're in the hospital, or, for example, if there's certain apps that have been developed that could also collect data, it might help a little bit with this stigma of not wanting to join these studies a little bit. Would just be my suggestion, maybe.
I
It certainly makes sense, so thank you. Yes.
One comment about the 0 to 13 or 14 and older. I think pediatrics is something about development. I think, and I would put it in the room to say puberty should be the change. So if you're post-puberty, then you should go to the adults, and not if you're 14 and younger, you should go to pediatrics. I think this would make much more sense than just having a strict age. And the other thing is, a very successful story was pediatric oncology. They changed really the outcome for their patients in the 70s to 80s. Maybe we can learn a little bit from them as well, from their mistakes, but also from their successes.
Just a few finishing remarks because it's getting near 4 o'clock. So please, yes?
when we discussed study design, so far we have actually not touched upon defining the study population. And I think it's quite important to consider whether patients are treatment naive or already on treatment, whether they are well controlled under treatment, or, and the treatment under study should be a replacement or an additional treatment in situations where the current treatment fails. And with regards to your suggestion to delay, randomized delay, for example, I think it very much depends on the current state of the patient.
Okay. Do we have any people on the line? You said there were some people had urgent questions? Because I think we... Are there any people on the line who want to raise an issue or a question? We have people calling in.
From Health Canada, Ariel and Barb, do you have any question?
I think you have to unmute your telephone.
This is Ariel. No, thank you very much. I am been paying attention to this, and I will probably have some comments later on. But no, thank you.
Thank you. Anybody from the room who wants to make any final comments before we will close, because it's 4 o'clock. Leanne, yeah, you have the last word.
I'm not sure I want that.
I have the last word, but yeah.
So part of the issue, I think I've heard a lot that maybe we have to move on. I mean, I think I heard that there is potentially the ability to use endpoints that are, again, patient-reported that would maybe be enough, or actigraphy that maybe would be enough, or a composite or collection of endpoints that would get at both function, clinical feeling, or improvement on a patient-reported outcome, and some sort of hemodynamic measure if it could be agreed upon and done in a consistent way that could be standardly or centrally adjudicated or measured. There's one area still, and the patient population that we'd have to be careful about in terms of mixing who has what. And that there's this potential ability, I think I heard very early in the day, that there is a population of treatment-naive patients who might be chomping at the bit to get actually access to treatment that could be very informative and maybe easier to enroll in terms of in a randomized way. But so the last question I have is about this randomization issue. So in terms of an ability to make sure that we, don't make an assessment on something, it sounds like, again, that there is still some discomfort, I think I'm hearing from our side about the issue of randomization to make sure that whatever treatment they're getting is, not biased, or the results are not biased by the fact that they had some sort of baseline characteristic that we did not account for. And is that too much? Are we saying, am I hearing that we're past for the people who have already been treated, that there's no way to try and figure out a way to randomize from one treatment to another, to take a patient, again, who it's not working in, or who is willing to switch? I don't know, but I want to throw that on the table because I want to hear specifically about whether randomization is not an option, except for the patients who are treatment naive and who really just want to get access to care, right? Then it's, but.
Anybody wants to comment on that?
Yeah. I mean, as I said earlier, it depends on what you want to randomize to is one of these issues. And I think there's fundamentally a difference between a study that's got, you think it's going to work in children based on the adult data. You don't know what the best dose is. You have a low dose, a medium dose, and a high dose, and no placebo. That's a very different beast to that trial that has a placebo arm in it as well. But then, as Norman said earlier, about how low is that low dose? Is it a low dose? Is it a very low dose, which is almost indistinguishable from placebo? So the context of randomization depends on the context of control. And I'd be interested to hear from clinicians. I don't want to and patients, don't want to kind of prolong this further. But if you are told, look, we don't know what the best dose is in children, we can model and we can predict it, and we think it's likely to be this, and so we're going to test a higher one and a lower one as well, because these drugs do have side effects as well, and it is a benefit-risk decision. is that something you would be prepared to be randomized in personally or to randomize patients to? And then if you said, well, and there's also a very low dose that you might get benefit from, but we might not, does that influence it as well? So.
Very short, yeah.
Yes, Naomi Lowy, FDA. What strikes me about this very excellent discussion is not just that patients are unwilling to go on placebo, which I completely understand. I'm a mom too. I probably would not want my child going on a placebo after they were stabilized, but also that there are other issues about parents not wanting their children in a clinical trial at all for various reasons, including being reminded that they have the disease. And my question, which is a rhetorical one, is can we get to a compromise where parents and patients will be happy to put their child in a clinical trial to get the data that we want in this compromise situation?
Yes.
I'll say very quickly, and this is my personal opinion, is that randomization is possible. And I think that if you look at the sildenafil data, to say to someone, maybe you're on very low dose and there may be an effect, I'd probably be willing to say that to a patient, again, using the sildenafil data and also looking at the bosentan data where we never have achieved the exposure in adults, with 3 different trials. So my colleagues can speak, but I think we could randomize to very low, pick a few, but there is just this hurdle for parents when they hear that word placebo.
Yeah. So last word, yes. Sorry. Yeah.
I just have an idea that is very simple, because we were talking about how to measure quality of life. How can you define that? And what can you do at home to record the data? And we have heard about the development of the app. And you all travel a lot, and you see that nowadays you see all these green, yellow, orange, and red buttons. So having a happy day, a medium happy day, and a bad day, if you have this on an app and before you go to bed, you press the button, happy day, medium happy day, you could easily collect these data and see that these patients on this and this medication have so and so many happy days and so many medium days. Just an idea to get a little bit of quality of life.
So, Cecile, we're developing this app with one of my colleagues, Wentrong, and I will have her send you the data.
It might be good to have some scientific data on this app. I mean, that's as regulators, yeah. Okay, last, yeah. Then I'm really going. Yeah.
Very, very short.
Yes, please.
I have the question. One question. Maybe it's possible to compare 2 drugs, 2 different drugs together, randomize one patient to one drug, another to the other. Maybe comparison of two drugs. Maybe that's the question to the pediatrician. If it's possible, maybe that's the way we compare bosentan with sildenafil, for example, and we've got then efficacy data in that way.
And you always have also the problem of assay sensitivity, but anyway. Okay, I think we need to close up. It's already 10 minutes past 4, and I'm sure some people need to get their planes. Well, I think we had a very interesting discussion. Unfortunately, I think we have raised more questions than we have answered questions, but I think it really has helped us in moving forward in making recommendations to industry how trials should be performed. I think it's clear that there is general consensus that we need specific efficacy studies in children. I think that question was positive. I think it's not everybody has the same basis for this. Some think it's more about dosing, others think that it's more about children being different from adults, also from a mechanistic point of view. So I think that's something we have to work out. I think it's clear that there are major barriers with regards to recruitment and with regards to validated endpoints and with regards to the choice of the population. So I think probably in the end we will end up with assessing trials on a case-by-case basis, and I think also the remark that one drug may be different from another one, so that the requirements may be different. So I think the magic word probably is flexibility. And also, if we write guidelines, and we plan to update our pediatric addendum, and I'm looking at Ameni after this discussion today with regards to the requirement in Europe, and we will certainly make them also available to the FDA and have discussion on that. I think flexibility is very important. And I think it's also very important that we take into account what has been said by the patient and the patient representative. I think we are very grateful that you were here today. I think it really helps us to be humble in what we require, and also that we should take into account that you have the willingness to enter clinical trials, in particular in pulmonary hypertension, is not very high. So I think it's also important for the clinicians and the triologists who were here today. So I think we have heard a lot of information. We will put it down somewhere in paper. I don't know. I'm looking at Cecile. What can we expect? Of course, all the slides will be available.
All the slides will be publicly available, and in a short-term future, we'll publish meeting highlights to secure perhaps some position where we believe we have reached agreement, and those where we need to carry on working upon. And then we could have other report or scientific publication as well, where we could engage with some of the stakeholders today, and probably as well guideline, which is a bit more regulatory. So we have at EU level the pediatric addendum, but we can look at a joint strategic document with FDA, as we have done for the Gaucher or something like that. But definitely, I think we need to keep having some discussion. Thank you.
Okay, but I think with the help of Cecile, I think we will certainly manage. Again, I started with that when I started today, but I also would like to finish this meeting by mentioning you as the great force behind this meeting and the big organization. And I would like to thank everybody who is here and who has participated, and the patient representatives and the whole organization. But in particularly, I want to thank you for what you have done. And I think you have really done also the patients and the industry a lot of help in moving on to make progress. I think in the end, that's because we are here. And to thank you, we have made a flower, and I would like to ask a big applause for Cecile for what she has done.